Picture the last time you saw a major city evacuate. Not a hurricane warning, not a wildfire creeping toward a suburb. I mean a full government ordered, no exceptions, get out now evacuation of a densely populated urban center in the middle of an active military conflict. Picture what that looks like on the ground. The traffic, the sirens, the people who don't own cars, the hospitals trying to move patients who cannot be moved. And the chaos that unfolds when a government tells 3 million people that the place they are standing is no longer safe and they need to leave immediately. Now, picture that city is Tel Aviv. That image is not hypothetical anymore. The order has been given. The streets are moving. And the specific, terrifying, world-altering reason that Israel's government concluded it had no choice but to empty its most populated metropolitan area is the reason that every single thing you thought you understood about where this conflict was headed needs to be thrown out and rebuilt from scratch. Iran did not fire another ballistic missile. Iran did not activate another proxy. Iran did not strike another military installation or another command facility or another piece of strategic infrastructure. Now, Iran deployed a weapon from a category of warfare that the entire post-World War II international order was constructed specifically to prevent from ever being used again. And I need you to sit inside that sentence for a moment, not with panic, but with clarity. Because the panic is already out there. The footage is already on every screen. The headlines are already using words that most living journalists have never had to type in a real-world context. They're not out there. What you are not going to get from the rolling coverage is an honest, grounded, strategically coherent explanation of what this moment actually means. That's what we're going to do right now. I have spent years inside the architecture of military intelligence. I have read the threat assessments that discuss this category of scenario in the careful, hedged language of people who hoped it would remain theoretical. I have sat in rooms where serious professionals talked about red lines and thresholds and the specific conditions under which the unthinkable crosses into the operational. Those rooms were not imagining this. They were dreading it. Stay with me. Because what comes next, the next 72 hours, the next strategic chapter, the long arc of consequences that flows from what just happened is something the coverage you've been watching has not come close to reaching, and you need to understand it clearly. Because this time, the story doesn't end with a ceasefire. Let me slow this down. Because the phrase weapons of mass destruction gets used in so many different ways by so many different people with so many different agendas that it has almost lost its power to communicate precise meaning. I want to restore that precision right now because the category of weapon matters enormously for understanding what the evacuation order means and what the strategic response options look like. WUMD is an umbrella. Under that umbrella sit three distinct categories of capability: nuclear, biological, and chemical, and they are not the same thing. They do not produce the same effects. They do not create the same tactical situation. They do not trigger the same legal, military, and political response architecture. Treating them as interchangeable because they share an acronym is the kind of analytical sloppiness that leads to the wrong conclusions at exactly the wrong moment. Here is what we know, and here is what we don't know yet. What we know is that Iran used something in the Tel Aviv metropolitan area that produced effects inconsistent with conventional explosive munitions. The casualty pattern, the nature of the injuries being reported from first responders, the atmospheric readings that triggered the evacuation order, these are not the fingerprints of a high explosive warhead. Something else happened. Something that crosses a threshold that conventional warfare by definition does not cross. What we do not yet know, what the international community's verification systems have not yet confirmed, is precisely which category of DMD we are dealing with. And that distinction is not a technical footnote. It is the hinge on which every subsequent decision turns. A chemical weapons deployment is catastrophic. It is a war crime. It triggers specific legal obligations, specific alliance responses, specific retaliatory frameworks that have been codified in international law since the Chemical Weapons Convention. It is also, in relative terms, a contained event devastating for those directly exposed, but not self-propagating, not capable of expanding the zone of effect beyond the initial deployment area. A biological or radiological deployment is a different category of problem entirely. It does not respect perimeters. It does not stay where you put it. It has the potential to become something that emergency management systems were not designed to contain, that international borders do not slow down, and that transforms a regional conflict into a global public health emergency on a timeline measured in days. The evacuation of Tel Aviv was ordered before the category was confirmed. Think about what that tells you. And the Israeli government, one of the most experienced, most sophisticated, most intelligence-saturated governments in the world, looked at what it was seeing and concluded that waiting for confirmation was a luxury it could not afford. That the precautionary principle, in this specific situation, with these specific readings, demanded immediate mass evacuation before the category was even locked down. That is not a decision that any government makes lightly. That is a decision that any government makes when the people looking at the intelligence tell them that the worst-case scenario is plausible enough that waiting costs more than acting. Here is the question everyone is asking, but nobody is answering clearly. How did we get here? Not tactically, the tactical picture is evolving, and the details will take days to fully emerge. Strategically, how did the conflict reach a threshold that the entire global security architecture spent 80 years trying to make uncrossable? The answer is not simple, but it has a shape. Iran did not wake up one morning and decide to use a weapon of mass destruction because it was Tuesday. This decision, if it was a decision, and I want to be careful here because the fog of conflict is real and attribution has to be established before conclusions are drawn. But if this was an Iranian state decision, it did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a calculation, a strategic calculation about costs, thresholds, and what happens when a state concludes that the conventional options available to it are no longer producing outcomes proportional to the threat it faces. Think about what Iran has watched over the past weeks and months. Israeli strikes on Iranian territory, degradation of Iranian air defense systems, strikes on military-industrial infrastructure that Iran spent decades and enormous national treasure building, strikes on the Revolutionary Guard Corps facilities, strikes on the precise assets that Iran had always treated as its deterrence architecture, the capabilities that were supposed to make the cost of attacking Iran too high for any adversary to seriously consider. Every one of those strikes sent a message. And the message Iran received was this: your conventional deterrence is not working. The threat of retaliation has not stopped the attacks. The escalation ladder that you believed had rungs wide enough to manage is being climbed faster than you can respond to each step. There is a well-documented pattern in military history, and I have seen it play out in Vietnam, in Iraq, in every asymmetric conflict, where a weaker party concludes that the conventional playbook is not going to produce an acceptable outcome. When a state or a military organization reaches the conclusion that it is losing by the rules it is playing under, it looks for a way to change the rules. Changing the rules, in the language of military capability, means reaching for something you were not supposed to reach for. The red line on TMD was supposed to be self-enforcing. The logic was that any actor who crossed it would face consequences so catastrophic, so immediate, and so overwhelming that the crossing itself was strategically irrational. No, the red line worked not because it was enforced. It was never enforced during the Cold War, because enforcement would have meant a nuclear exchange, but because every actor with the capability to cross it believed that crossing it guaranteed their own destruction. Iran has now tested that belief. And the question that the strategic community cannot avoid right now, the question that is being asked in every classified briefing room on Earth, is whether the belief was correct. Whether the consequences that were supposed to make this crossing irrational are actually going to materialize in the way the theory required. No, because if they don't, if the red line moves rather than triggers the response it was supposed to trigger, then every WM red line everywhere in the world has just become a negotiating position. Inside the Israeli government right now. Not the public statement. You can read the public statement. The actual decision environment that Israel's leadership is operating in, because that decision environment has features that the press conference is not going to reveal. First, the evacuation itself is not just a protective measure. It is a signal. When a government evacuates its largest city, it is communicating something to its adversary that diplomatic language cannot convey with equal precision. It is saying, you have forced us into emergency mode. You have moved us from conflict management into existential response territory. And in that territory, the constraints that govern conflict management no longer apply in the same way. Israel's military doctrine, the doctrine it has operated under since 1948, the doctrine refined through multiple wars and refined again through decades of counterterrorism and refined again through the current conflict cycle, has always been built on a principle of disproportionate response. You hit us, we hit back harder and faster, and in a way that restores deterrence so completely that the next attack is not worth contemplating. That doctrine was designed for conventional conflict. It was designed for a world in which the escalatory ceiling was high enough that disproportionate conventional response could operate below it with room to spare. Today, Israel is looking at a situation where the conventional response framework, no matter how large, no matter how precise, no matter how operationally devastating, may not match the category of the attack that was just conducted. Conventional bombs do not answer a chemical or biological strike in kind. And answering in kind even if Israel possessed the capability, which is a matter of deliberate strategic ambiguity crossing that line in response, would trigger a global response architecture that Israel cannot afford to face. So Israel is trapped inside a paradox that its doctrine was never designed to resolve. The attack demands a response that exceeds anything it has previously done, but the category of the attack forecloses the most direct proportional response. And every option in between, every calibrated, conventional, strategically targeted response package has to be measured against the question of whether it actually restores deterrence or merely produces the next escalatory step. The Americans are in this room too, whether Israel likes it or not. The United States has treaty obligations, strategic interest, domestic political pressures, and its own set of red line commitments that all intersect with whatever Israel decides in the next 48 hours. Washington does not get a veto over Israeli military decisions. But Washington's position, its willingness to support, its willingness to constrain, its own parallel military planning shapes the option space in ways that neither government is going to discuss publicly. That conversation is happening right now. It is not pleasant. Here is the piece of this story that I guarantee is not getting the coverage it deserves because the cameras are on Tel Aviv, the cameras are on the evacuation, the cameras are on the international condemnation and the Emergency Security Council session, and the footage of people streaming out of a city that has never been emptied before. What the cameras are not on is every other capital in the region, where governments are doing something far more consequential than issuing statements. They are revising their threat assessments. For the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, the WMT threshold crossing changes the calculation in a way that is almost impossible to overstate. These are governments that have spent billions on American military hardware and American security guarantees specifically because the American security umbrella was supposed to prevent the regional conflict from reaching this threshold. The American commitment was the ceiling. The ceiling was supposed to be impenetrable. It is not impenetrable. And now these governments are sitting with a question that their defense ministries have probably modeled, but that their political leadership hoped would remain in the category of theoretical exercises. What does our security look like if the regional conflict has no ceiling? If the WMT threshold, the one that was supposed to be the absolute, guaranteed, unconditional firebreak between conventional conflict and something else has been crossed by a regional actor that is still standing, still functioning, still capable of further action, today's events are evidence that at least one regional adversary concluded the guarantee was bluffable. Egypt is watching, Turkey is watching, Jordan, which shares a border and has its own complicated relationship with every party in this conflict, is watching. Every one of these states is conducting a quiet, urgent, entirely private reassessment of what their strategic position looks like in a region where the rules just changed. And then there is Russia and China, both of whom are permanent Security Council members, both of whom will veto any resolution that creates binding enforcement mechanisms, and both of whom are drawing their own conclusions about what the American-led global security order looks like in a world where its most important red line just got crossed without triggering the enforcement mechanism the red line required. This is no longer a story about Israel and Iran. It stopped being that story about an hour ago. I want to talk about Washington right now because Washington is where the most consequential decisions of the next 72 hours are going to be made or avoided. The American position is structurally impossible, and I do not use that word for dramatic effect. I use it because it is analytically accurate, because the constraints pushing on American decision-making from every direction simultaneously cannot all be satisfied, which means every available option involves accepting costs that the political system was not designed to absorb. Option 1, full military intervention. Deploy American forces in a decisive, overwhelming, conflict-ending operation that removes the Iranian regime's capability to continue this conflict. This is the option that the hardest voices in Washington are going to demand. It has the emotional logic of decisiveness. It has the political logic of appearing strong. It also has the strategic logic of igniting the exact regional escalation that American military planning in the Middle East has been trying to prevent for 4 decades. Iranian proxy networks across the region in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in Lebanon do not sit still while American forces conduct operations against Iranian territory. Iranian ballistic missiles have ranges and quantities that would put American forward positions at serious risk. The potential for this specific operation to expand into something that looks more like a regional war than a contained military action is not a fringe concern. It is the planning baseline. Option 2, targeted punitive strikes. Hit the specific infrastructure associated with the WMD program. Hit launch sites, production facilities, command nodes, make the cost visible without committing to a full operational campaign. The problem with option 2 is the same problem that targeted punitive strikes always have when the target is a WMD program. A WMD program is not a single building. It is dispersed. It is hardened. It is built with exactly the assumption of strike and survive. You can damage it. You probably cannot destroy it in a single campaign. And a WMT program that has been damaged but not eliminated is still a WMT program, except now it is operating from adversary leadership that has just been attacked and has every incentive to demonstrate that the attack did not achieve its objective. Option 3, lead a multilateral diplomatic and legal response. Push for an international coalition. Build a sanctions architecture. Refer to international legal mechanisms. Construct a framework that isolates Iran globally and applies comprehensive pressure without military action. The problem with option 3 is that it requires Russian and Chinese cooperation that is not coming. It requires the speed of multilateral action that international institutions structurally cannot produce. And it requires selling the American public who just watched a UMD strike on a close ally on the wisdom of a diplomatic process that will take months or years to produce consequences, if it produces them at all. I have watched administrations face versions of this trilemma before, in Bosnia, in Syria's chemical attacks, in the slow-motion escalation cycles of multiple Middle East conflicts. And here is what I know from watching those moments. The decision that gets made is rarely the decision that anyone would have designed from scratch. It is the decision that the political system, under the specific pressures of the specific moment, was capable of producing. And the gap between that decision and the strategically optimal decision is where the long-term costs accumulate. Let me map the realistic scenario space. I'm going to be precise about what is operationally probable, what is plausible, and what remains in the space of serious possibility that I genuinely hope does not materialize. The first and most probable immediate path is a massive Israeli conventional strike package targeting the entirety of Iran's WMD-associated military-industrial infrastructure, not a targeted hit, a campaign. Israel has spent years building the intelligence picture and the strike planning that this scenario would require, because Israel is not a country that makes strategic decisions without planning for them several steps in advance. The scale of the strike would be unlike anything Israel has previously executed, more extensive than the 1981 Osiris strike, more sustained than the strikes on Syrian nuclear infrastructure, more comprehensive than anything in the current conflict cycle. The complications are real and they compound quickly. Iranian air defense, while degraded, is not eliminated. Iranian ballistic missile retaliation conventional, this time, but in quantities and against targets designed to maximize strategic impact, is pre-planned and pre-positioned. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of global oil supply transits, becomes an immediate pressure point. Energy markets, already stressed, absorb a shock that economists have been modeling as a worst-case scenario. The second path, de-escalation through back-channel negotiation, requires something that does not currently exist. It requires a credible intermediary with enough standing in Tehran to deliver a message and enough trust in Jerusalem to be believed. Qatar has played this role in past moments. Amman has played this role, but the specific threshold that has now been crossed, the UMD use, creates a domestic political environment in Israel that makes any de-escalatory conversation that does not include absolute guarantees of Iranian capability elimination essentially politically unsurvivable for any Israeli government. And the third path is the one I lay out with full acknowledgement of how much I hope the analysis is wrong. A broader military exchange that involves not just Iran and Israel, but the proxy networks, the regional states, the American forces in theater, and potentially based on the legal and treaty obligations that would be triggered by certain targeting decisions allied nations who did not choose to be in this conflict but find themselves drawn in by the architecture of their commitments. The thread connecting all three paths is this. The WMD crossing is not something that de-escalates naturally. There is no version of this story where the international community processes the event, issues statements, and returns to the previous operating baseline. The threshold has moved. The world on the other side of that movement is structurally different from the world before it. And every path forward has to be navigated in the new world, not the old one. Pull all the way back with me, past the strike, past the evacuation, past the next 72 hours, and the decisions being made in crisis rooms right now. Because there is a story here that is going to outlast all of it, a structural shift in the architecture of global security, that the immediate crisis is the opening chapter of, not the whole book. The post-World War IO security order was built on a specific bargain. The bargain was this: the nations that possessed weapons of mass destruction, first the nuclear powers, then the chemical and biological powers, agreed to treat their use as categorically unacceptable, not strategically inadvisable, not tactically impractical. Categorically unacceptable in a way that was supposed to be self-enforcing, because every actor understood that crossing the line meant consequences that exceeded any conceivable strategic benefit. That bargain has held imperfectly, with violations at the margins, with countries like Syria testing the edges in ways that produced responses calibrated not to set definitive precedents, population center, and remained a functioning state. Until today, what Iran has done, and I want to be precise again, because the verification is still in process, but the evacuation order tells us that the Israeli government's own assessment crossed a threshold. What appears to have happened today is the first state-directed WMD deployment against a major allied urban center in the modern era. That fact does not live only in the Middle East. It does not stay inside this conflict. It propagates. North Korea's leadership is watching. They have their own WMD programs. They have their own deterrence calculations. They have their own assessment of where the red lines are and whether they are real. Every conclusion they draw from today's events about the survivability of WMD feeds into their own strategic behavior. Every non-state actor with aspirations to WMD capability is watching. The lesson they are drawing, that a state actor crossed the line and the immediate response was evacuation rather than obliteration, is a lesson that does not have a simple rebuttal. Every American ally, NATO members, Pacific partners, Gulf states is sitting with the question of whether the alliance guarantees that have defined their security planning for decades actually function in the specific scenario where they are most needed. The scenario where a peer or near-peer adversary decides that WMD use is strategically rational. The scenario that the entire security architecture was supposed to make impossible. Here's the brutal truth that no government in the world is going to say out loud right now, because none of them can afford to say it out loud. The deterrence architecture that was supposed to prevent this from happening failed, not partially, not in a technical or operational sense that can be patched with better systems and more investment. Conceptually, the theory that no rational actor would use WMD because the consequences were too catastrophic was not wrong. It was incomplete. Not account for the actor who concludes that its own destruction is either preferable to the alternative or that the consequences might not materialize the way the theory predicted. Iran made a calculation to know yet if that calculation was made by the highest levels of the state or by a rogue element within the military command structure. Attribution matters enormously. It changes the response architecture. It changes the accountability framework. It changes the diplomatic options. But here is what does not change regardless of attribution. The event happened. The knowledge that it happened is now part of the strategic environment. WMD use automatically triggers consequences severe enough to deter it has been put in the stress testing machine, and the machine is running. Every actor watching the outcome of that test will update its own calculations accordingly. I've said this before about different moments in this conflict, about the carrier strikes, about the Site 81 hit, and I'll say it again here, because it is the only honest frame for understanding what we're watching. This is not a story about a specific strike, a specific weapon, a specific target. This is a story about the collapse of an assumption. And the assumptions that underwrite the global security order are not like physical structures. They don't make a sound when they fall. They just quietly stop holding weight. And the thing built on top of them slowly, then suddenly tilts. Tel Aviv is evacuating. 3 million people are moving through the night away from a city that has been the center of Israeli civilian life since the state existed. That image, those streets, those people, that specific kind of organized panic that governments produce when they have run out of options that don't involve telling people to run, is the image that defines this moment. But it is not the most important image of this moment. The most important image is invisible. It is the image of every defense ministry and every capital on earth sitting with the same classified analysis, looking at the same data, and drawing the same quiet, devastating conclusion. The red line moved. And a world that knows the red line can move is a world that has to be navigated with a fundamentally different map than the one everyone was using this morning. Iran did not just hit Tel Aviv. Iran hit the architecture of the world that was built so this could never happen. And unlike a building, that is not something you can rebuild overnight. That is not something a retaliatory strike repairs. That is not something a ceasefire agreement restores. The old world ended sometime in the last several hours. One looks like nobody in any of those rooms has an answer they're confident in, and that, more than anything else, is what should keep you watching,